law ends, tyranny begins. John Locke, 1690. The people who cast the votes don't decide the election. The people who count the votes do. Josef Stalin. By the time this episode of History She Wrote finishes editing and goes up, an election will have been held in Hungary. And hopefully there will be a resolution to it. Although elections after the fall of communism in 1989 to 2010 were seen as free and fair, various organizations, local and international, have challenged the elections held since then. That, however, is not within our history purview. And the truth is that even before communism fell, Hungary didn't exactly have a history of free and fair elections that included the majority of its citizens. In fact, when the first modern parliamentary elections were held in Hungary in 1848, only about 7% of the population was actually allowed to vote. The list of those allowed to vote did not include women, of course not, don't be ridiculous, nor were most men allowed to vote due to particular requirements of things like land ownership and education. 7%. Not only were those numbers of those eligible to vote shockingly low to our modern sensibilities, yet another fact of voting in Hungary greatly stymied any free expression of voting at all. There was no such thing as the secret ballot. Voting was done openly, where everybody could see who and what you supported.
This way, the voter couldn't be intimidated before the voting or punished afterward. Power groups, of course, looked for ways to get around it. For example, a man might be ordered to write his name or put an identifying mark on his ballot, so his vote could be checked.
The problems with this should be immediately obvious. For one, it is much easier to pressure someone who has to announce their vote. Social pressure comes to bear, and anyone who is attracted to a candidate outside the accepted range in their area could expect to be, at the very least, browbeaten until they supported the same candidates as everyone else. Even more of a problem, voting for the wrong candidate was a surefire way to get a person blacklisted, with all the opportunities for jobs, earning money in general, and even social opportunities severely limited. Vote for the wrong person in the open voting system, and your family could lose everything. There was an echoing argument for more universal suffrage made at several times over the next 60 years, but it wasn't until 1911 that protests demanding universal suffrage began to actually gain momentum, culminating in the Bloody Red Thursday on May 23rd, 1912. There were casualties, 6 killed and several hundred wounded. And finally, the Hungarian half of the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary was forced to act. It's not like they wanted to. As the politician István Tisza stated, Hungary is not at that stage of social development that could afford total and unlimited democracy. It would not be the last time this sentiment would reign. In any case, the powers that were did deign to undertake a study that would provide a basis for electoral reforms. It was not a quick process. The suggestion that women be allowed to vote was hooted down. No one in power wanted such a thing. Some changes were made, which did raise the percentage of citizens eligible to vote to about 15%, from about 8%. The reforms were scheduled to take effect in 1915, but they did not. They were cut off by the onset of World War I. Then, with an electric shock, the monarchy of Austria-Hungary fell. The end came quickly, but it wasn't completely out of the blue. Around the middle of October 1918, the Hungarian National Council was formed in the Budapest Hotel, Astoria. A transition government the first Hungarian Republic, was set up amidst the ongoing Aster Revolution. None of this was done via election. Still, decisions were being made. On November 16, 1918, the Great National Council issued what is known as the People's Resolution. It stated an urgent need for legislation defining the election system and set out that system used to determine voting eligibility should include universal suffrage and secret ballots. Legislation was pushed through the Constituent Assembly. Voting would be allowed for all males over the age of 21, and literacy was not required to vote. Women were also being given the right to vote from the age of 24, although literacy was required in their case. The new voting rules legalized about 3 times more people on the voting rolls. The thing is, the new powers that were in Hungary were still uneasy about actually implementing universal suffrage. So, in time-honored Hungarian tradition, they put it off. But it couldn't be put off forever. Elections were set for April 13th, 1919, but again, events would overcome the planned elections. After the end of World War I, Hungary knew they would lose a significant amount of land. Leaders thought they had a handle on what would be asked of them, but a subsequent invasion on almost all sides by the Romanians, the Serbs, and the Czechs rolled over the country. The Romanians eventually made it as far as Budapest itself. On the one hand, this helped end the Aster Revolution. On the other hand, it resulted in what was called the Vix Note, which demanded even more territory to be handed over to other nations. Hungary would lose about 72% of its territory in the resulting post-World War I peace. This demand caused the resignation of the government, and hoping that the communist agitator Bela Kun could persuade the Red Army to come help them defend some territory from the victorious Entente, all communists held in prison were released overnight. Of course, they seized the government and then proclaimed the Hungarian Soviet Republic on March 21st, 1919. Needless to say, the April 13 elections were not held. There were indirect elections that created the National Assembly of the Confederate Soviets, but the goal of universal suffrage was still way out of the picture. Bela Kun was in direct contact with Lenin himself, and the Red Army really did have the intention of coming to Hungarian aid, but they couldn't. In 1919, the Red Army was bogged down fighting in a place that may sound quite familiar: Ukraine. Everything old being new again, so on and so forth. Unable to hold and increasingly unpopular, the communist government of Hungary fled in August 1919. The Hungarian Republic came back into power for a few short months, and finally, in January 1920, elections were held according to the guidelines set forth in the People's Resolution. Admiral Horthy, who had control of the army, was not impressed by the results of the election. And on March 1st, 1920, the Kingdom of Hungary was reinstated, with Horthy as its regent. The 1920 election, although its results did not last, was done by secret ballot, and voting for those qualified was compulsory. Suffrage was still not universal, but it was much more inclusive than at any previous time in Hungary's history. Horthy remained in power until 1944, and although elections were held for parliament under his leadership, state machinery was manipulated to make sure that Horthy's party and Horthy himself remained comfortably in power. To refer back to the beginning of our episode, those who count the votes determine who wins. And altogether now, everything old is new again. Free elections were not held in Hungary again until 1945, and those would be the last free elections until after the fall of communism. Even though the Red Army was occupying Hungary, land reform had been implemented and inflation was at ridiculous levels. The communists only managed to eke out about 17% of the votes. But no matter, it was not the first time that an election could be subverted by other means in Hungary. This time, it was by the use of salami tactics. As defined by Matthias Rakasi in 1952, salami tactics demanding a little more each day, like cutting up a salami, thin slice after thin slice. With their 17% and the backing of the Red Army, the communists demanded control of the Interior Ministry and police force. They then began a campaign of assassinations, arrests, accusing members of the majority smallholders party of reactionary plots, and even threatening harm to the family members of opposition politicians in order to seize complete control, something they readily accomplished. After 1945, free elections were not held in Hungary again for another 45 years. And in 2026, the rhymes in history are enough to create a ringing in the ears of even those who are not listening.
What to do